Hello, and welcome to Arts and Entertainment.
With Chris and Randall.
I'm Chris,
I'm Randall.
and welcome to the show. Today, we're going to talk about why are mainstream Hollywood comedies becoming so middle-aged. But before we get into it, as always, I like to ask people, please like, subscribe, share, comment. We really want to know, how are we doing? What could we do better? What would you like to see in the future? Let's just check in and keep the conversation going. Randall, what's the best way to get in touch with us?
Well, check out our website, chrisandrandall.com. Also, check out our Facebook page, Arts and Entertainment with Chris and Randall.
Excellent. We really want to hear what you have to say, what you think. Occasionally I do hear from you guys, and I'm always really happy to discuss stuff when people say, hey, I really like to do this, or, you ever thought about giving Randall a chance to speak? I'll consider that. I will. Randall, I promise, I will consider giving you a chance to speak. But actually, for a couple of minutes, I'm just gonna jabber on my rant, so that the audience will know what the hell is Chris all about. So, I was recently on vacation. I was stuck in a hotel, and I was watching an old movie from the early '90s called City Slickers. Did you ever see it?
Yeah, I saw City Slickers.
Yeah, Billy Crystal, Jack Palance. So I'm in a hotel and they have just HBO. So I'm watching. I haven't seen it in a billion years. City Slickers. I think I literally saw it when it was in the movie theaters back in '91. So it's Billy Crystal. He's a man in his early 40s. He and his two best friends, played by Daniel Stern and Bruno Kirby, they're going through a midlife crisis. They're going to go to a dude ranch. They'll meet Jack Palance, and it's gonna really change their life. The comedy is so I never realized how chock full of boomer humor. It's so full of references to the 50s and early 60s that there's a lot of things I just no idea what's going on. Even the actress Patricia Wedding, who plays his wife, she's from 30 something. There's just not a lot of youth in it, but it's very much a middle-aged person's comedy. And I looked it up, and at the time, Billy Crystal was 41 when he made that movie. And then, just last week, I saw this movie, Free Guy, which just came out in the theaters. It's a comedy with Ryan Reynolds. And Ryan Reynolds is the exact same age. He is 41. And when I went to see Free Guy, I thought, well, clearly this is not a movie that's supposed to be about a midlife crisis, and it's definitely not. It is technically a movie about a character from a computer game who doesn't realize they're living in a computer game. But technically speaking, this is the kind of film that you would imagine is really geared for people in their teens to late 20s who are playing computer games. I assume those are the folks who are playing. Randall, do you play computer games?
Well, it's been a while. I mean, I don't really play them that much anymore.
All right, so I believe it's the young folk who play it. And here's a movie. It's directed by Sean Levy, who did all the Night in the Museum movies back 10 years ago. And he did Date Night, which also came out about 10 years ago. And here's 40-something Ryan Reynolds, and Taika Waititi plays the villain. And he's in his late 40s. They're making jokes about they're making jokes about Different Strokes. They're making the TV show from the early 80s. They're making jokes about Greatest American Hero, another show from the early 80s. It's so clear to me that regardless of advertising, it's very hard to really see this as a young person's movie. Even in the movie, they call Ryan Reynolds, for once someone jokes and calls him 40-year-old virgin. They find a way of kind of dealing with the wild age difference between him and the female character in this movie, but it's a very strange experience. And I had a similar experience earlier this summer when I saw Cruella, which stars a 34-year-old Emma Stone playing a 21-year-old young Cruella from the Disney movies. And in the film, it takes place somewhere between the late 60s and mid 70s, from the psychedelic rock era in London to the punk rock era in London. And I thought it was going to be a movie that was kind of for children, but it's so steeped in the history of late 60s, mid 60s, 70s pop and rock culture and fashion culture. And you have to buy, and it's very easy to buy Emma Stone as a 21-year-old, even though she's about, only a few years shy. She's technically middle aged or just about to enter it. And
How old is she?
She's 34. And she's been around for almost 2 decades. So it got me to thinking that our state of comedy, like I've never seen it before, has really become dominated both behind the camera and in front of the camera with a middle-aged faces and a middle-aged sensibility. And by that, I truly mean anywhere from like people who are what we'd call cusper boomers, born in the 60s, to cusper millennials, born in the early 80s. Is that group of people between the ages of 38 and 58 that seems to be really holding up a lot more of the comedy space behind the camera and in front of the camera. And I just want to give you some like context just to think about it. So when you and I were kids, I know you were born in 75, I'm born in 65. So when I was a kid, like in the late 70s to early 80s to late 80s, the hot new comedic film actors were people like Steve Martin and Billy Crystal, Robin Williams, Eddie Murphy, who in fairness is a cusper, Bill Murray, Goldie Hawn. And then you get into the 90s and more of the Gen X kids start coming out. You got people like Adam Sandler, Will Smith, Ben Stiller, Mike Myers, Jim Carrey, Hugh Grant, Sandra Bullock, Drew Barrymore, Cameron Diaz, Jennifer Aniston, Janine Garofalo. And it's like kids coming out of Saturday Night Live, the Ben Stiller Show, Mr. Show. It's coming out of the alt comedy scene. And you have movies like Something About Mary. You've got Liar, Liar. It's a certain kind of zaniness that you're starting to see. It's very youth oriented. And then same with the 2000s, where you've got people like Will Ferrell and Jack Black in stuff like Anchorman and School of Rock, and Steve Carell in 40-Year-Old Virgin, and Zach Galifianakis in the Hangover movie. Paul Rudd, who broke in the youth movie Clueless, is just starting to get all over the place in the early 2000s. Sacha Baron Cohen with Borat, Ryan Reynolds. And then about 10 years ago, things get even more broad, I would argue, because you start seeing much more female comics getting their own films. People like Tina Fey, people like Melissa McCarthy, Christine Wiig, Emma Stone, Rashida Jones. Then you start seeing, again, a lot more of these young-ish actors like Andy Samberg, Seth Rogen, Jonah Hill, Jason Segel, Sarah Silverman, Tiffany Haddish, Josh Gad, Kevin Hart, Michael Cera. I mean, there's definitely a lot. But I would notice that since maybe 2013, it's really started to thin out the herd. And an example of this is someone like, Jonah Hill and Adam Driver, who, wouldn't you say, I think of them as young actors, right?
Okay.
I think people tend to think of them that way. They're both 37 years old, which again, isn't that far off from the age of Billy Crystal in When Harry Met Sally, or again, when he was 41 and having a midlife crisis in City Slickers. I mean, that's not, technically speaking, once you're past 35, hey, I hate to tell it to you kids, once you get past 35, you're middle-aged. I'm 55. If I live to be 110, I'm guessing I'm middle-aged. But, if we're really starting to be honest, that is the age of maturity. And it's the same thing here with our actresses. I always think of like Anne Hathaway and Emily Blunt as young women, don't you? I mean, you always think about Devil Wears Prada, but that movie has come out well over a decade ago. And again, Anne Hathaway and Emily Blunt, they're both 37. They're getting pretty close to 40. And again, even people like Emma Stone, who's 32, and Michael Cera, who's 33. I know I gave you the wrong age earlier about Emma Stone. Again, these people have been around for 20 years. Uh, Same with our directors, Judd Apatow, Wes Anderson, Noah Baumbach, David Wayne, Paul Feig, Sophia Coppola, and Sean Levy, who did Free Guy. Those people are all in their 40s and 50s. Even the young directors who've been breaking out, like I can't pronounce his name, but Yorgo Lanthimos, who did The Lobster and The Favorite, which is one of my favorite films for a comedy.
Which one, The Lobster?
The Favorite. I've never seen The
Favorite.
Lobster.
Okay. Yeah,
is it good?
Yeah. It's quirky.
Yeah, and that stars. He works with mainstream people like Colin Farrell and Emma Stone, and again Taika Waititi, who's really getting hotter and hotter with comedies like Thor Ragnarok and Jojo Rabbit.
Waititi is great at comedy, which is unusual. It seems like nowadays.
Yeah,
him and James Gunn.
James Gunn is in his 50s. Same deal. Harley Payton is.
Wait, how old is Waititi?
He's 47.
See, okay, so you're saying that like after 2013, you're saying new talent has fallen off a cliff? Is that what you're trying to say?
Well, I'm saying you can start to see a trend, like even
what's
for
the trend?
Here, let me get to it. Okay, so people like that who are considered the hot young male directors, and even if you look at female directors, so Greta Gerwig, who did Lady Bird, which is a comedy, did very well. Not a mainstream comedy, but a critical success. And Olivia Wilde, who did Booksmart. You saw that, right?
Yeah, I've seen Booksmart.
And you liked it.
Great movie. Yeah, Wilde is. She could be a really good director. We'll find out.
So
she makes a few more.
Well, my point is, both of those women are 37, so they're not kids either. And again, as actresses, they've been around. So like all of these people that I've just mentioned have kind of been working as either actors, writers, directors for about 10 to 15 years prior to their success. They're not overnight sensations. Whereas in the 80s and 90s, people like Kevin Smith, Spike Lee, Ed Burns, Steven Soderbergh, they were overnight sensations. They would make one indie film, maybe a second indie film. It would do very well at Cannes or Sundance, and they were on the map. So in the last, we talked about this just a few months ago about how comedy in the last 20 years in film seems to be getting worse and there's fewer of them. This is slightly different, but not that different in that I really want to show you that there's kind of this weird island now that's starting to happen where the club is closing its doors, is what I'm saying. It's really becoming more of an ARP center, for the lack of a better word.
There's no room for new talent, is what you're saying.
And this is a toughie because I don't. Is
that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, but like let me just go a little bit further. Yes, but let me take this further. In action film, you need physically fit people. In thrillers, you need good-looking people. In romances, you need good-looking, physically fit people. So in comedy, what you really need is persona. Comedy, I think, is the most persona-driven medium of all the genres in film. Because if you think about it, right? Like if I told you, hey, Randall, you want to catch a Steven Spielberg film, you kind of know what it is, but you don't know what it is, right? That could be anything from E.T. to The Color Purple.
Okay.
To Munich, right? It's kind of all over the place.
Okay.
But if I was going to say to you, hey, Randall, you want to catch a Wes Anderson film? You kind of know what that is, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Want to catch an Adam Sandler film? You know what it is. Mm-hmm. So whenever there is either a director or an actor in comedy, just their established persona, unless they're doing one of those movies where they break against type, like Adam Sandler in a serious movie, which happens, every 5 years? Like in, what was that, what was that movie he just did, where he is in a serious role?
Right, he's a jewel thief or something.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, okay.
He's a jewel dealer. He's not a jewel. But my point is, except for those movies where they go against type, their persona is the genre of comedy. That's what you're getting when you get a Steve Martin comedy. That's what you're getting when you're getting an Adam Sandler or a Will Ferrell or a Kristen Wiig. By the way, Barb and Star, go to the Vista Del Mar. No one saw it. Totally recommend it. So when you have young talent, it changes the conversation. It reflects the sensibility of a new generation. The For right now, that would be Generation Z, that would be the early millennials. It offers a refreshing take. And I think what's going on here is uh, comedy, which has normally traditionally been a young person's game, it's normally about growing up, right? So, like most mainstream comedies, which is not to say every comedy has to be this way, but in our lifetime, right? Most comedies we see that are done by Hollywood studios end with either the character in a marriage of a sort or making a lot of money in a field or both, right? Either like they're doing well financially or they're doing well romantically or both. So a lot of the comedies of today have been for the last 30 years about men child or man woman child growing up and taking responsibility as opposed to say descending into anarchy.
Okay, so you're saying like in the past, like say you're talking about like the 60s, 70s, maybe even the 80s, you had like a lot of comedy done by young people, people in their 20s, like sketch comedy, of course, famous for this, like Monty Python, Saturday Night Live. And so much like the Rolling Stones, Mick Jagger might have said back in the 60s, I'm not going to be a rock star forever. Suddenly the Rolling Stones, or it's now the Rolling Stones is like the rock band forever. And all the people that got big in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they're just still doing the same stuff, and there's no room for the new young people. Is this what you're saying, Chris?
You know, very apropos, Charlie Watts unfortunately just passed away yesterday at the age of 80, which is technically the first rocker I would argue to be successful and yet die of natural causes. I mean, rock stars are now kind of going away like Frank Sinatra would go away, working, successful, but not from drugs and alcohol, just from being very old. So you're really onto something. I mean, yes, there have been a few movies that have specifically dealt with being middle-aged, like Noah Baumbach's While We're Still Young with Ben Stiller, or This Is 40 with Paul Rudd. But there used to, strangely enough, be in the 70s and 80s far more comedies with people like Jack Lemmon or Dudley Moore dealing with being middle-aged. Whereas the kinds of movies that these 40-something, 50-something actor directors are working on, in fairness, the characters they're playing could be played by 20-somethings and 30-somethings for the most part.
So you're saying these comedic actors like Adam Sandler and Ryan Reynolds, they're still playing, they're doing roles that somebody in their 20s should be doing. Just like Mick Jagger, Mick Jagger's still doing rock and roll, even though somebody in their 20s should be doing the rock and roll. Is this what you're saying, Chris?
I will say this much. The two most popular genres right now in comedy, for mainstream comedy, are action comedies and family comedies. So clearly, our top comedic talent, when they're doing family comedy, be it live action or animation, they do have to have actors who look old enough to play a parent. But let's be blunt. I think someone at 35 is old enough to play the parent of someone under 12. And somebody certainly 40 is old enough to play the parent of a high school senior. You know, they're old enough to play, or maybe that's where you just put middle-aged actors in general, is as the parent in teen comedies. But, you're raising a good point, which is it used to be that in our youth, there were teen comedies and raunch comedies that took place in summer camps like Meatballs or Porky's, or movies like American Pie, or movies that took place in high school like Clueless, or movies that took place in college like Animal House. And those kinds of comedies, which regardless of whether or not they're good films or bad films, regardless of whether you agree to the taste and the humor, those are the comedies that normally traditionally introduce you to the Alicia Silverstones, the Emma Stones, the Jason Segels. These are how we get to meet our new comedic talent often, is in a kind of comedy. So let's get into.
Okay, you're saying they're not making movies like that anymore.
Well, wait, let's go into the possible theory. So that was my first.
Okay, but that's what is that what you're saying though, Chris? Yes or no?
I'm saying yes, absolutely.
Okay,
yes.
Okay, let's go on.
Yeah, let's go on. I've kind of at the end of the rant. So let's get into how did this happen? And as I just said to you, Randall, I do think one of the reasons is there's just less comedies in film. There's just less R-rated sex comedies, for lack of a better word.
Well, no one wants to make an R-rated movie anymore. I mean, they make less money. I mean, they used to R-rated movies like would sell well in the home market and maybe get Oscars and awards and stuff like that. Maybe have a shelf life, but I guess they're not. They've never been as profitable. So why make them?
Well, R-rated comedies today are things like Deadpool, Suicide Squad. That's where you see them. You see them really more in the superhero genre, which I guess technically is its own
Well,
form of a comedy
yes. Well, I
or
want to say
subgenre.
I want to say Deadpool was a huge risk. You know, they made it for a fairly low budget in comparison to the other superhero movies. I mean, it was a passion project of like Ryan Reynolds and the director, and you know its success and the success of Joker too. But its Deadpool's success especially like helped. It helped. Suicide Squad. Is Suicide Squad an R? The
Yeah,
new one? Yeah. See,
yeah.
it helped a movie like that get made. You see. I mean, because they trailblaze. But yeah, it's like the studios don't really want to make movies like that. They're probably not going to be as profitable.
And even the PG-13s. I mean, the thing, and I don't want to get too deep into this argument about the state of comedy because I really my own personal feelings are when people say, "Oh, you can't be funny anymore." Cancel culture. I'm like, screw you, buddy. You're a racist, a sexist, misogynist, and you should shut up and let real people be funny. But that said, I will say that raunch comedies are very problematic as a genre these days because, in fairness, they are often really offensive and they do fall into that category. And I do think studios are not really wanting to make those kinds of films anymore. I feel that the anarchical spirit that is inherent in comedy is becoming just more of a commercial risk. And on the converse, I'll say this too. I think that where you're really finding youth comedy today is on like Netflix and Disney. But we'll get back to that later. So I don't think once you get rid of a lot of the raunch comedies and youth comedies, I really do think you're kind of cutting down the opportunities for young people to break in. Another theory I have, as we've just said, is that I think a lot of young people now, it's the Disney Channel, it's the Netflix movie, it's the ABC Family movie. I think that streaming services are really kind of going after, are trying to fill in that gap. What do you think?
You mean the gap for raunch comedy?
No,
What
the
gap are
gap
you
for
talking about?
the gap for youth comedy. So like, Kissing Booth or Have You Ever or Pen 15.
Sure.
These
All the
are
streaming
where you're
services. Sure, all the streaming services. Due to the nature of the streaming services, they're trying to fill every single gap they can. I think, and especially like a house like Netflix or Hulu, they're not going to get criticism for content like say a Disney Plus would. Could I
Yeah,
just say something I've been thinking about since you've been talking?
absolutely.
I feel like some of this is cultural. Like for instance, you talk about the '60s through the '80s. You're talking about an era of a lot of cultural upheaval. You're talking about the baby boomers coming of age. You're talking about a time when there was a counterculture. There was so you had like a lot of chaos. Hollywood was in chaos. I mean, they had trouble selling movies to younger kids. Until Easy Rider came out, they had a problem trying to figure out what these young kids even wanted to see at the movies. And I think that culturally speaking, so anyway, that kind of chaos, that kind of cultural upheaval, that kind of chaos, it provides a lot of opportunities for outsiders, for young people. I believe we are inside the peak, perhaps, of a much more conservative time, and I think like Donald Trump's election is just a perfect example of that. So you see this in our culture. You see much more conservative cultural product. You see, of course, studios and others banking on like big players, on names, on established figures. See when you go back to like the '60s or the '80s, you see those established names tanking, in the box office. You see people not wanting to watch those established names anymore, because they were the establishment, and the kids didn't want to trust anyone over 30, like that. I think yeah, this conservative era, we have like I think that contributes to a lot of what you're talking about.
I think it's interesting to say that because I was just thinking about the fact that I just said right now, comedies really tend to end with, hey, I'm in love, or hey, I'm going to be responsible now and start my own mug business, or both. But if you look at what I think to be, in my opinion, one of the most subversive teen comedies of the 1980s, Risky Business, it does end with him making a lot of money and having come of age romantically, but it's perverse, right? We're not supposed to be going like, yeah, man, I gotta be my own pimp. That'll get me into Princeton, and I should lose my virginity to a prostitute. Like, I honestly felt like, it was Paul Schrader who wrote Taxi Driver. He was kind of really making a critique of suburban middle-class culture. But I think what happened in the 80s is somewhere along the line, the success of that film, people lost the perspective, so that by the end of the 80s, instead of that being subversive, that you could make a lot of money doing something really crass, making a lot of money, like even in Ghostbusters, they're financially successful, becomes more so fitting in society and ranking highly in society becomes far more important than, say, Caddyshack, which comes out in 81, right? Caddyshack ends with Rodney Dangerfield saying, hey, everybody, let's get laid, and anarchy rules. Animal House, right? Another boomer comedy, ends with the frat, right? The fraternities destroying the homecoming parade, right? Anarchy rules. This goes all the way back to like the Marx Brothers, where anarchy rules at the end. But at the end of a movie like City Slickers in 1991, the same generation, just, your family hugs you, your wife cares for you, you get a new girlfriend, and you have a job that you're going to do well. There's no anarchy that ends City Slickers.
Well, what year is City Slickers?
91, and it's the product of a middle-aged bunch of people. That's the boomers not in their youth now. That's the boomers at middle age. So I'm not entirely sure if it's a societal point of view or it's just the middle age point of view in general, that instead of trying to tear society apart, wants to find its place in society. And maybe that's what is one of the downsides of having so many middle-aged people right now in comedy, is that instead of making comedy subversive, it's more about how can a man-child or a woman-child find their place in society as a civilized member of society, which is comedy that actually just affirms the values of the viewer as opposed to challenges the values of the viewer. So it's far less subversive, and I would argue, I hate to say it, far less potent.
Well, yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think most movies, comedies included, aren't really subversive at heart. I mean, you like to talk about Risky Business a lot, but it's because, that's unusual. I mean, yeah, Schrader, he wrote Taxi Driver. I mean, those are unusual movies with their point of view. So I think, yeah, culturally, we're in, if you want to look at our comedy culture, I think we're in the 50s. We're in like a Leave It to Beaver type comedy era rather than like a Monty Python comedy era.
Unless you're willing to accept that some of the darkest comedies that have come out in the last several years are so dark that it takes a minute to realize they're comedies. Like 2019, honestly, may have been the greatest year in 2 decades for dark comedies, because Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is a very dark comedy. Knives Out is a dark satire. Jojo Rabbit is an extremely dark comedy.
Well,
even Parasite, not a Hollywood mainstream film, but clearly the Academy Award Best Picture of 2019.
Well,
all of those films are the darkest, most subversive comedies you could possibly put out.
Okay, well, I've already made an argument on another show about Parasite, but I don't know if it's as subversive as people think. But
let's go with
let me say,
Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Well, let me say something about these other movies. So it's interesting that Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, you picking out Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and what was the other throw? Oh, Jojo Rabbit. So these are movies based on other time periods, and these are movies based on other time periods that are, shall we say, much more chaotic than our time period. Much more, there's much more cultural upheaval in those time periods. And I think that those movies are cultural. They're examples of what's going to be coming. I think that because the culture will change again. We're going to go into a much more. I feel it, Chris. We're going to go into a much more chaotic, freewheeling, liberal, lefty culture. It's coming up. We're going to get out of this conservative era pretty soon. And those movies are like those movies are like, you're right. I think they are. They're not as stuffy as like most movies coming out today. And they're able to achieve that only by looking back at other eras that are just as crazy. Because our era is so stuffy.
Just to agree with you, I think that when Rian Johnson does Knives Out, even though it doesn't take place in the past, it is very much a satire of the old school Agatha Christie style murder mystery.
Right.
So
it feels like
something about it. Yeah. It feels like it could have come out in the 60s or 50s. Right. It doesn't feel at all contemporary. Right. So I think it's fascinating that people like Rian Johnson, Quentin Tarantino, and Taika Waititi. These people are all in their late 40s to late 50s. So they're all hardcore Gen X people. And instead of really bringing anarchy into today's world, like say Sidney Lumet did with Network, the movie we've talked about before, they're looking to a time really even before their own they're looking into a past that either occurred before they were born or just when they were children, as opposed to deal with the subversiveness. So I do feel like what I was saying earlier to you about television is a much better outlet. I think TV in many senses is much more representational of younger voices, different voices, and subversive voices. And that might be what's going on right now, is that television streaming services and their need for content are in an opposite position, say, from film companies that need to be very picky about where they spend their money. HBO, Showtime, Netflix. Why did I pick Showtime? That was the dumbest thing I could say. Hulu, Amazon, Netflix, HBO. They're gonna see what sticks, and they're much more willing to take risks. And I do think that that period of Hollywood that we were speaking of, which is the 70s through 80s, was much more about making films and taking risks than the contemporary film market, which has to deal with things like the foreign market, right? I mean, a lot of what we're seeing now in Hollywood are movies that can do well in non-English speaking countries like China, right?
Yeah, well, so you're talking about comedies specifically, and most comedies don't really translate that well, country to country. Yeah. So Hollywood is definitely chasing the Chinese market now. I mean, I think the Chinese market now is like the biggest market. I mean, it was during COVID, of course, and China might become the biggest market for theater forever now.
I'll come to it later, but I did some research on the 100 highest grossing films in the last 20 years. And there were quite a few that were Chinese films I've never seen. So Chinese comedies do well in China. So they don't need American comedies. They've got their own sense of humor. They've got their own language. They have their own sensibility. In most countries, physical comedy is still far more popular than verbal comedy, which is why I think we've really started to see a decline in romantic comedy, which used to be so popular.
Yeah, romantic. Yeah, for younger people listening to this, there was an era. When was it, Chris? Late 80s to early 2000s. There were romantic comedies wall to wall in the theaters.
Wall to wall. They always take place in New York about a girl with a really glamorous job who meets a guy, probably Hugh Jackman, who doesn't really know how to grow up, and he's going to do his own thing. But she's going to wind up with him at the end anyway, and they're going to own their own cake company, and they're going to have children. I mean,
I don't know who was watching these.
I can say, but I don't want to say, but they're all on HBO right now. And I do think that Netflix is trying I think Hulu is trying. I think even a movie like Palm Springs is trying to bring back, or Always Be My Maybe. They're definitely trying to bring back those films, but Always Be My Maybe is made by a bunch of 40 somethings. It's a good movie. I like it a lot. And it could only have been made with Netflix money because it only plays to an American market. And
Well, since you're talking about Netflix, let me just say something else I've been thinking about during this discussion is sometimes these things happen because of market forces, right? So in the 60s through the 80s, you had the studios were divested of their theaters, so that opened the way for theaters in America to show foreign films, which started a whole cultural revolution in America. Well, it was part of the cultural revolution, I'd say. And you also had TV networks were forced to display content the 7 to 8 slot. And so those kind of changes, they really opened the door for outsiders, opened the door for non-corporate content, for like independent content. Like, you're talking about a Roger Corman.
You're absolutely right that, today, Roger Corman's, the Corman of today, believe it or not, is Tyler Perry Studios. I was in Atlanta last month. Oh my God, you have no idea how many people work at Tyler Perry.
I've read a lot about Tyler Perry. The guy's amazing.
I spoke to a guy who worked with Tyler Perry. He shoots a film normally in about anywhere from 7 to 14 days. That is it. He just cranks them out. He cranks them out hard. But if you want to learn filmmaking in the Corman style, get a job working for Tyler Perry.
Well, I will say something about Tyler Perry. He built a whole studio in, where is it, Atlanta?
Yeah.
And I think that maybe one of the reasons he did that is because he could do everything non-union. I mean, I could be wrong about that. But you might be considered that smart or evil. I don't know. But Tyler Perry's very smart, I'll say.
I forgot how it works. It's union, but it's union in a weird way. But my point is, Tyler Perry is middle-aged, and he tends to cast middle-aged people to make middle-aged films, albeit African Americans. They're still middle-aged African Americans. And I think you're getting to an interesting point, which is that indie films in the 80s and 90s, the Sundance era, that era where films would really come out, indie films now are really co-opted by the studios. The studios bought the small indie filmmaking studios. A lot of people who come out of indie film really are people who have been kicking around in TV or other things for a long time. Or they're people like Olivia Wilde or Greta Gerwig, who can just leverage their own acting experience to get their own film. So that even indie films, it's not the young film student who's breaking out anymore, at least not in comedy. The young film student definitely is breaking out in action film, crime film, and horror. If you really are a young film student right now and you make a really good low budget action film with no stars, or you make a really good low budget horror film with no stars, Hollywood will have you do the next Avengers movie. But if you want to, I've been watching trailers just to prepare the show for indie comedies that are available on like Netflix, or if you just go to YouTube and do streaming new comedy trailers, and they're terrible. They'll never see theaters. Even if the pandemic ended tomorrow and everything was back to normal, it would not happen. So I really would say that the indie market outside of TV just doesn't really exist in an authentic way. And then I think the other thing I want to talk about is that Hollywood, I think, always operates under this belief that success breeds success, right? So why replace people when the people you've got are bringing in the money?
Yeah, what's interesting about that is this is a situation in Hollywood that was very similar to the late 70s where, yeah, success breeds success. It does work until it doesn't. I mean, maybe at one point, the Hollywood product will just like fall off a cliff and no one will want to see it anymore. I mean, that happened like late 70s through early 80s. I mean,
it happens all the time.
That ushered in a whole new era of content. So we'll see what happens.
I mean, but at some point, people will say, I don't want to see a Judd Apatow film. I don't want to see Zach Galifianakis. I don't want to see Paul Rudd. I don't want to see Taika Waititi. I want something new and fresh. But Hollywood will keep on doing. And if you notice, this is not just true in comedy. This is true in everything but drama, that action films, thrillers, horror, superhero movies, Hollywood loves to do franchise. Hollywood loves to do sequels. Hollywood loves to do remakes. and reboots, so that Hollywood in general, this isn't just true of comedy, Hollywood in general would rather do more of the same than take a risk. And you just in comedy is where it starts to feel a little perverse. Now, I know, and we can get into why aren't young people what in these comedies, but I did my research, and believe it or not, the majority of film goers are between the ages of 18 and 39. So to say they're not going to the movies isn't true. In fact, the three most common groups of people that go to the movies are 18 to 24-year-olds, 25 to 39-year-olds, and 60 plus, which means, weirdly enough, the generation that is most represented in film is not even in the top three of film goers.
Right. So, well,
demographically speaking,
right, the young kids are going to the movies to see people their parents' age act like they're their age, and it's working right now. Do
you think that is because young people love watching people their parents' age acting like fools? I gotta admit, when I was a young person, and Steve Martin was not a young person, or Bill Murray was not a young person, or Gene Wilder was definitely not a young person, I loved watching people like that, or Mel Brooks, old enough to clearly be my dad. I loved watching people old enough to be my parents, or people old enough to be my uncle or aunt, just making a fool of themselves. You think that's kind of like one of the things inherent to comedy for young people?
Well, I think these people are just good. Okay, they're talented people. You know, they've had a lot of experience doing what they're doing. I mean, if you look at like the era of like the 60s through the early 80s, I mean, you're looking at an era where young people did want to watch other young people, but they talked about the generation gap a lot during that time, but that may have been an unusual era. I'm not exactly sure, but there was. I mean, it's funny because you look back at some of those performers from that era. Okay, so you're talking about old vaudeville type people, like from the 70s, 60s through the 80s, and their comedy is kind of different, right? I mean, it's not the same kind of. It's not like George Carlin, right? I mean, there is like a real cultural shift right there. Like you were talking about raunch comedy. Like none of those old vaudeville people ever did that kind of raunch comedy. That came out in the 70s. I mean, Carlin was like famous for pioneering some of that. But today there isn't really much of a cultural shift. I mean, you have people like Ryan Reynolds doing this movie based on video games, which all the kids love today, and he understands the video games just as well as the kids. I mean, maybe we're in a new era thanks to the internet where we're not going to have a similar kind of cultural gap because everyone is experiencing. Everyone can experience the same culture on the internet. I mean, I was talking to you before the show about how I think the culture is fragmented a lot, and that hurts comedy. That hurts all kinds of culture. But I mean, I don't know. Maybe now I'm thinking maybe there's a case we made for an opposite effect happening. Because you have a culture that's accessible to everyone now. Whereas like, if you're really young, you don't understand like the world of the let's say the 50s through the 80s through the 90s. Even that world was a world of hard to find like independent publications and magazines and probably weird screenings at local indie theaters. I mean, people didn't all have access to the same kind of culture, but today it seems like maybe people do. I mean, you have, there's a phenomenon where you have people on TikTok, trends go off on TikTok, and it's not just, see, if this was 1960, a trend that flew through the teenage community would stay in the teenage community, but because this is 2021, you have trends on TikTok that fly through some teenagers on TikTok, and then some adults get in on the trend, and then nobody says anything, and nobody says, "Oh, now the trend's got to be over." Remember, Chris? Like there was a time when people would say, "Oh, now that an adult is doing the trend is over." I haven't heard anybody talk like that in a while. I mean, maybe.
No, actually, it's interesting. I have a friend. She's a comedic actress and a storyteller. She is 82 years old, and she is now blowing it up with 4 million viewers on TikTok. So you are right. Like uh, Annie Corzin was a year younger than my mom in high school. Go look her up on TikTok. She was Dolores Crump on Seinfeld, and she is experiencing a brand new career as a TikTok comedy sensation. So you're right in that youth of today are far less ageist than I certainly was in their age group. That's a good point. I mean, I used to love older people, but not in the way that you're just saying. Like, no, I would say, do you think it's also possible that because when we were kids, there wasn't a lot of family live action comedy and there wasn't a lot of good animated family animated comedy either, that this generation that's coming up now that grew up with Ratatouille and Sunny with a Chance of Meatballs and Jumanji, among other things, that they've gotten so much comedy that was done by big name actors in the comedy world from their youth, who are like, Kung Fu Panda, for example, like because they grew up with the Jack Blacks and the Peyton Oswalds and those people, they want to watch them because they already have an ongoing relationship with them. In the same way, in fairness, I loved Gene Wilder in Little Prince, and I loved him in Willy Wonka. So as I got older and I saw him in Silver Streak and then Stir Crazy, up until the time that his movies really started to suffer when I was in my mid-20s, Gene Wilder was just somebody who was a very close part of my life, even though I never knew the man. So do you think that these kids are just holding on with a stronger identification to people like The Rock now or something?
The phenomenon you just described, I've been thinking about it for a long time. And I finally ran across a term on the internet. Okay, it's called parasocial interaction. And
oh, yeah.
maybe I'll
explain it. Could you explain it a little bit for us, please? It's very important. I've been thinking about it too, especially during the pandemic. It's been most potent. So please, share this.
I'll read a little bit from Wikipedia. Parasocial interaction refers to a kind of psychological relationship experienced by an audience in their mediated encounters with performers in the mass media, particularly on television. Viewers or listeners come to consider media personalities as friends, despite having no or limited interactions with them. PSI is described as an illusory experience such that media audiences interact with personas as if they are engaged in a reciprocal relationship with them. And this was a term coined in 1956.
Huh. Well, I definitely think that is an interesting explanation for why we're holding fast to these people, because certainly now more than ever, there are more ways that Zach Galifianakis can come into your room than Gene Wilder could have ever have come into your life back in the day. So I guess, Randall, my question to you is, what does this all mean? What do you think this all means?
Well, your original contention was that comedies are disappearing since 2013. Is that correct?
No, my original contention is that comedies are clustering around mostly Gen X with a handful of boomer and late millennial clusters in the talent pool, and that they're hoarding up all that
I'll tell you, Chris, because originally when I was talking to you earlier before the show, I told you, oh yeah, I think the culture is flying apart and fragmenting, and the young kids, they're not really taking part of that culture. They're going off on their own other culture. But after this whole discussion, Chris, now I'm starting to think that maybe the older people are still working and still doing the top movies because everybody knows who they are and they're good, and the kids are like. And our culture maybe is becoming even more unified, because think of it this way, like one of the things that divided the generations culturally in the past was cultural products, let's say like a television show or a movie, music, they would be released, and then if you didn't buy it in that window or you didn't see it in that window, you didn't experience it in that window, it would be gone. So years later, only people from your generation, let's say, would remember this cultural product, would have this cultural touchstone. But today, every single cultural touchstone is on the internet somewhere. So everyone can experience the same culture all the time. I mean, you can be a high school kid and your dad can tell you about, some artist from his childhood, and you can instantly look them up on the internet. You could never do that before. So I guess maybe what we're really seeing is since 2013 is the star effect, which some people talk about in economics. It's just the best people just keep getting the most jobs, and why hire new people? Why hire outsiders? I mean, everybody knows who they are even more now than in the past. There's no generation gap, so there's no point in hiring new people at all.
Well, it's an interesting thing you're saying because I originally was going to go with the premise that comedy is dead because the last pure comedies to do really well at the box office were Bridesmaids, which was 2011, Hangover 2, which was 2011, and Ted, which is 2012. And they were like 500 plus $1 million top grossing films that were first and foremost comedies. But if you're willing to see, say, comedies not as a genre, but as a subgenre, and really mostly as a subgenre in action adventure like superhero movies or, as family films, then both live action and animated. I was just looking at 2020 during a pandemic, and in the top 10 grossing films of that pandemic year, more than half of those films, three-quarters of the top 10 films on that list, really were action comedies or family comedies. And even a movie like Cruella, which I just said to you, really strikes me much more as not a family comedy. It's almost like the Joker, if Disney did the Joker. I mean, I guess I did see it with people who had kids there, but the kids looked super confused. They just did. I mean, but even a movie like Cruella, that made $226 million so far. So absolutely a success. And even a movie like Ghostbusters 2, the all-female version of Ghostbusters that came out in 2016, which is a comedy, that also made about $229 million. So they're not unsuccessful. And Free Guy, which I still think of as not an action comedy, but a comedy action, which is to say like Night at the Museum is comedy action, whereas Jumanji is action comedy, meaning in an action comedy, the action leads and the comedy follows. In a comedy adventure, maybe that's a better word, the comedy leads and the adventure follows. So even Free Guy has now been the number one film for the second week in a row, and it's had the best second week of any summer release during this pandemic. It's already made back the $100 million to make it, and it's also on track to be a success. So comedy isn't dead at all, and apparently America is, in the world, is okay with the status quo. So here's where we are today. I assume, as you said, at some point things will change, but
Maybe.
they haven't
We'll
changed.
see. We'll see.
They haven't changed yet, folks.
I think it's really interesting to think about what the internet's doing to culture, because the internet is akin, I think, to the invention of the printing press, right? So when the printing press gets invented, and people start making all these books, and people can read these books, it changes the culture everywhere, all over the world. I mean, wars probably started, religious wars because of the printing press. So you can see that, the internet is already, transforming our cultural experience, our world. I mean, I don't know, Chris. I don't know what's going to happen, but maybe there won't be. Maybe there won't be like a shift back to some kind of weird 60s, 70s, 80s counterculture type civilization, but maybe we'll all just be brought together and be better informed.
I have no idea. I again, this is where I truly feel my age. But I want to thank you, Randall. This is you brought in a lot of light. I really want to hear, especially from those of you who are 35 and under, who do see a lot of mainstream studio comedies, what you think. Until then, I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
We'll talk again soon. Bye.
Bye.